Chapter 14. The Round Table. They woke early the next morning, in spite of their late night of work. Oliver felt groggy and dull as he and Clara ate breakfast and then packed up the tent. They set out in the early morning light, making their way back to the ruins of the old Roman amphitheater. They hoped that the early hour would mean fewer people visiting the old site. The entrance at Stonehenge had been cleverly hidden, so that they had been able to enter without anyone else noticing, even though it had been crowded that day. Oliver wasn't so sure that they would be as lucky with this door. It was in the middle of the circle, completely exposed if anyone happened to be watching, and they still had to guess the password. It was a relief to find that nobody else was at the amphitheater when they arrived. Oliver led the way into the bowl and walked towards the center, but something was wrong. As he approached the place where the door had been the night before, Oliver saw and felt nothing. Concerned, he turned to Clara. "It should be right here," he said. Clara looked into the ring and waved it, but nothing happened. "This is strange," she said, "but the writing said we were supposed to give the password in the sunlight, so there must be a way to access it." Oliver considered the problem for a minute. "I do not think it is likely the door itself has moved. Remember that the clue had two parts to it. The password must help us get to the second part. Maybe the password is what you need to make the door appear in the daytime." "It is worth a shot," said Clara. "Should I just start reading the passwords then?" She pulled out a paper with a list of all the passwords they had thought up the night before. "Yes," said Oliver, "but read them in Latin and in English. That should cover us if there is another trick." Clara took a deep breath and then started. She read their list of words clearly and audibly. They had decided that a knight would have spoken the password bravely and therefore loudly. Oliver didn't want them to miss opening the door just because they hadn't spoken the password loudly enough. The list was long, but Clara continued straight through. It felt like it was taking them an eternity to get through it. The longer they went, the more Oliver felt his hope beginning to fade. They had put their best guesses at the beginning. Doubts crept back into his mind. What if they were wrong? What if they couldn't get in? Clara finished reading the list. Nothing had appeared, and the only thing to change was that the sun was now higher in the sky. She handed the list to Oliver. "Here, you try it. Maybe someone magical needs to speak the password like a spell." Oliver took the list and began to read. It felt like he was reading spells, but nothing happened. He read line after line, speaking Latin words and their translations into the empty field around them. Eventually, he too finished the list, but the door still refused to appear. Clara took the list back, pulled the pencil from her pocket, and wandered away to sit on the hill. "I am going to brainstorm some more," she said to Oliver. Oliver pulled out his wand and began trying to force the door to appear. He tried revealing charms and conjuration spells, anything he could think of to charm or transfigure the archway back into view. For all his efforts, nothing worked, and as the sun climbed higher still into the sky, Oliver sat down, frustrated, in front of the spot where he knew the door was supposed to be. The sound of approaching voices stirred Oliver from his frustration. He stood up and went over to Clara. "Someone is coming," he said, sitting down next to her on the hill. Clara looked up as an old couple made their way over the berm surrounding them and into the bowl. The old woman waved at them merrily and resumed chatting to her husband. Clara and Oliver waved back, then Clara buried her nose back into the notes she was carrying. From what Oliver could hear, it sounded as if the old couple were gossiping about a neighborhood pie-making competition. They didn't seem in any hurry to leave. Oliver forced his attention back to the missing door. Clara was reading a page of notes with the clue written on them. She was making a small edit to add the Latin original of the riddle. Oliver watched her writing it out, and then he had a thought. "Clara, what if we need to read out the whole clue in Latin? What if the clue is the password?" Clara stood up. "That could be it. We may not be looking for a specific noble truth. The phrase is the key." She and Oliver walked casually into the center of the circle. Oliver glanced over at the old couple and saw that their backs were turned. "Now," he muttered to Clara. Clara read out the clue in Latin, in temporum solis, verum nobilis locutura, signum noctu ingredi. She and Oliver looked expectantly at the spot where the door was supposed to be, but it did not materialize in front of them. The old couple's voices drifted across to them, the old man speaking fondly about the flaky crust on a pie that he was looking forward to. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. Oliver's head bowed. They weren't going to figure it out. He was out of ideas. "We are not looking for a noble truth," Clara murmured to herself more than anything else. "The phrase is the key." She looked around. Oliver looked up too, and saw the old couple walking over the hill in the direction of the exposed walls they had seen the night before. He looked at Clara, confused. "Via nobilis," Clara said clearly. Oliver knew it had worked. He knew it before the door materialized in front of them. He felt it working. "I do not understand," he said to Clara. "We were overthinking it," Clara replied. "The phrase did not ask us to speak any specific noble truth. It just asked us to say the words noble truth. So I did." Oliver looked around. The couple hadn't reappeared, but everything around them seemed oddly hazy, as if he were looking at it through a lot of water. He couldn't hear the birds any more either, or the voices of the old couple, which had still been drifting over to them. He turned his attention back to the door. It still had no handle or knob to open it. Apparently they still needed to figure out what Knight's sign was. They could see now that it was a very old door. The metal bands that Oliver had noticed the night before formed a sort of large square in the middle of the door. Oliver turned to Clara. "What is Knight's sign? Or should you just say it like you did with noble truth?" Clara turned and spoke to the door in scene nocturnum, but nothing happened. She looked at Oliver. "No, I did not expect that to be it. The clue makes it feel like we need to do something else. Night sign, whatever that is." Oliver looked back up at the arch and the silver lettering. It was clearly visible and shining in the light, so much different than last night when they couldn't see it at all. A muffled sound behind them made Oliver glance backwards. The elderly couple had returned, but they didn't seem to see Oliver and Clara. They merely wandered back through the circle and sat back down on the opposite hillside. "I do not think they can see us," Oliver said uncertainly. Clara watched the couple too for a moment. "It would appear they cannot hear us either," she said. "Either that or they are extremely unobservant." They turned their attention once again to the arch. "Can you see anything now that you could not see before?" Oliver asked Clara. "Is there anything we missed in the dark?" Clara looked up at the inscription too. "No, it looks the same. It would have been a lot easier last night if we had had a bright moon to help us see, though," she trailed off. "A moon." "What?" Oliver asked, sensing that Clara was on to something. "Oliver," she said excitedly, "Themunis the night's sign. It makes complete sense. It should have illuminated the writing on the arch. The moon reveals the clue, and it's the answer to the second part of it." Oliver realized that Clara was right. The moon was the defining feature of the night. He still wasn't sure what they were supposed to do, though. Clara was ahead of him, though. "It is so obvious," she said without breaking a stride. "Look around us. We are standing in a circle. We are looking for a round table. The moon is a giant circular shape in the sky." She extended her hand towards the door, and with her finger she traced a large circle inside the square area formed by the metal bands. Immediately, a silver circle appeared on the door where Clara had traced her finger. It radiated a pale light for a moment before becoming a shimmering band on the door. Clara extended her hand again and pushed gently on the door, and it swung open. "That was impressive," Oliver said as they stepped through the door. "I should have realized it earlier," Clara said. "I always used to enjoy word games and riddles. The answer is they're staring you in the face, but you always overthink it." They had stepped into a magnificent circular room. It was made of grey stone, and the walls were decorated with brightly colored tapestries. The walls were tall, and at the top they gave way to a spectacular set of windows that ringed the room. The sun shone in through them and seemed to bounce off the surfaces, illuminating everything. High above them, a domed roof capped everything off, but directly below it. "The round table," Clara said. "Would you look at that?" Oliver said softly. It was a large wooden table, ornately decorated and shaped like a ring, with the center missing. It was set in the center of the room, but it was elevated a little by a single-step platform that ran around it. Oliver stepped up to it and walked around the table examining the surface. It was flawlessly smooth, and in front of each seat it was inlaid with other woods to create scenes of knights performing heroic deeds. Looking at the open space in the middle, Oliver could see another, smaller, table there. Oliver circled the table, looking for a way into the center area. At one point, Oliver found that the table was hinged. It was so seamlessly done that he almost missed it, but his fingers just felt the slightest of gaps that marked the spot. He raised the piece up so he could step into the center of the circle, but at that moment, Clara called out from somewhere behind him. Oliver turned to look and saw that Clara was investigating a tapestry. He walked over to her and she pointed at it. "Look, that is Arthur and Excalibur, right?" Oliver looked, and sure enough, a knight wearing a crown was wielding a sword that was blazing with light. "Maybe these tapestries can give us more clues," Clara suggested. They circled the room, looking closely at any that seemed to show King Arthur. They showed some of his most famous deeds, fighting against armies, facing monsters, pulling his first sword from a stone, and an especially large one showed him standing atop a mountain with a bright sword in hand, flanked by two robed and hooded figures. "These tapestries are amazing," said Clara. "They do not seem to tell us what happened to Excalibur, though, do they?" Oliver observed. Then, remembering the section of table he had raised earlier, he said, "Let us go look at that area inside the table. I saw another smaller table inside of it. It might have a clue for us." They walked back up to the opening in the table and slipped through. Oliver walked straight to the small table at the exact center of the room, while Clara circled, looking at the designs on the larger table. Oliver looked down, and to his surprise he saw a spectacular, gleaming sword sitting on the table. "Clara, come here. Look, it is right here." Clara hurried over to look. The table, Oliver now realized, had been built with a lip that went around it. The lip was deep enough that Oliver had been unable to see the table surface until he was standing right over the top of it. Oliver reached down and picked up the sword. It wasn't heavy, not the way old swords usually were. Oliver had seen a few swords cross his and Humphrey's desks during his time at the ministry. A lot of ancient wizards had bewitched their swords, and they sometimes popped up in Muggle archaeological digs. But the sword wasn't light, either. It felt solid and balanced. "Look at the way it catches the light," Clara said. "It is practically glowing." Oliver admired it and noticed the fine workmanship of the handle. This would definitely represent a combination of wizard and Muggle craftsmanship, possibly involving goblins as well. Of course, it does not look like silver, but they do work in other metals too. "I am sorry, did you say goblins?" Clara asked. "Oh yes," Oliver said. "They are known for being the best craftsmen. Goblin-made silver is among the most valuable and prized of substances in the world." "There is so much more to your world than I could have ever imagined," Clara said. "You have no idea," Oliver grinned. "Let us take this and go. Maybe we can get it safely back to the archive today." Oliver stepped out of the circle and down off the platform. He was just turning back to the door where they'd come in when he heard Clara call out from behind him again, but this time she sounded worried. "Oliver, I cannot step off the platform." Oliver spun around. "What?" "I cannot step off the platform," Clara repeated, a note of urgency in her voice. Oliver stared and stammered. I do not understand." He turned and walked back to Clara. Stepping back up onto the platform, he tried to push against her, but she couldn't pass the threshold of the platform. Oliver stepped off again and looked up at Clara, whose face was showing a mixture of confusion, shock, and fear. He looked down again at the sword. I wonder, he said quietly, maybe the sword has something to do with it. He tried to give it to Clara, but he couldn't get it into her hand. He couldn't touch her at all. It is not working, Clara said. You have to step up here. Oliver stepped up and pushed the sword into Clara's hand. Taking her other hand in his own, he tried to step down together, but found that he couldn't. Clara's hand slipped through his, and she was standing below him, holding the sword. It must require some sort of payment, Oliver said. One of us has to stay. No, said Clara. Unacceptable. Do you want the Black Hand to have that? Oliver asked. They will not hesitate to sacrifice someone here. We are not them, Clara said. This is not right. It does not make sense. And with that she sprang up the step and slipped back into the center of the table. When she reached the small table in the center where they had found the sword, she turned and looked at Oliver, who had followed her. Everything we have done so far, we have done together, Clara said to him. We have had to do it together. Why should this be different? Clara put the sword back onto the little table. We will go out and talk to Humphrey and Archibald about it. We know how to get back in whenever we want to. Maybe they can help us to figure this out. Clara started to walk away from the table, a disbelieving Oliver following behind her. They passed out of the circle made by the table, and Clara closed the hinged piece behind them. Taking one last look behind him at the little table, Oliver stepped off the platform with Clara. All at once a strong wind ripped around the room. The tapestries on the wall flapped angrily, and Oliver doubled over, his arms covering his face. Just as quickly, though, the wind was gone, and the room was once again still and peaceful. What was that? Clara asked, alarmed. Oliver straightened up. Maybe we activated some other spell. I do not really know. They looked back to where they had left the sword. Clara made a small gasping noise and pointed into the center of the room. Look, the table that was there in the middle, it is gone. Oliver was processing the same realization. Everything else seemed the same. The round table was there, and the tapestries. Oliver looked around the room, taking it in again, and then he saw it. Standing near the door was the same small table that had held the sword. Oliver started walking towards it, transfixed and curious. He heard Clara behind him say, Oliver, where are you going? And then, oh, when she too saw the table. It felt like an eternity as Oliver walked around the room. Reaching the table, he looked down into it and saw, not a bright shining sword, but a small circular shield. An ornate silver braid ran around the outer edge of the shield. Inside of it was a smooth, dark field that was punctuated here and there by silver stars that popped off the shield in little sparkles of light. At the center, a brightly glowing silver boss rose above the rest of the shield like a full moon in the night sky. Incredible, Oliver muttered. It is beautiful. Unbelievable, Clara said excitedly as she reached down to pick it up. There is a name for this shield, but I do not recall it. I know it means face of the evening, though, and looking at it now we can see why. She held it up and allowed the light coming in through the upper windows to hit it properly. They admired the shield as it glinted elegantly in the light until Oliver finally asked, How and where did we even get it? Clara answered straight away, It was a test. I must have been. We put the sword back and we were given the shield. It was a test of our loyalty to each other. Oliver thought about it. If that was a test, then maybe the sword was not even the real Excalibur. Is that possible? Clara asked, finally lowering the shield. We need to tell Humphrey and Archibald about this. Absolutely, said Oliver. We need to tell them it is time to get moving again. A few minutes later, Oliver and Clara slipped into the cover of the trees they had camped under the night before. They had stowed the shield discreetly into Oliver's travel case, as they thought that carrying a shield around might draw someone's attention. Oliver thought they were fortunate, though, to have emerged from the doorway and not have been seen. Perhaps it was the magic which kept the doorway hidden, but nobody seemed to notice when Oliver and Clara had materialized out of thin air in the center of the old amphitheater. even though there had been a number of visitors mingling around the site. Clara retrieved Humphrey's parchment and a pencil from a leather bag she wore around her waist. Oliver conjured a small table and chairs for them to sit at, and Clara wrote just 4 words: "We found Arthur's shield." The short reply came quickly: "Well done." Oliver took the pencil this time. "What now?" The reply took a minute to appear on the page. "Tell us more about it." It took a little while to fully relate the whole story of what had happened through the parchment. Humphrey and Archibald were especially curious about the test, using the sword as a lure before determining if they were worthy of receiving the shield. They kept asking probing questions about the fake Excalibur, and the shield, and the room, and every other little detail. Oliver was writing so much and so quickly that his hand cramped up, and Clara had to take over. When Clara's hand had also cramped, Oliver took over again and insisted that Archibald and Humphrey give them a new location to investigate. "We can answer all of your questions as thoroughly as you wish when we see you next," he wrote. "For now, we must take advantage of our lead over the Black Hand." "We believe your next destination should be the Isle of Man," came the reply. "You should take a train north to the port of Liverpool, where you can catch a ferry that will take you over to the island." The legends and stories around Excalibur vary wildly, but we think it is most probable that the Isle of Man was the mythical Avalon, and that it was the site of Gladys Ferrerius's forge. Oliver frowned slightly as he read the response. The pencil in his hand was poised over the page, hovering just off the surface of the parchment as he considered what he was reading. Then, the question formulated in his mind, he wrote, "Is the sword there?" Clara suddenly seized the pencil and parchment and wrote underneath Oliver's question, "I've always heard that the sword was thrown back into the lake where Arthur had first received it from the Lady of the Lake. Is that not true?" The parchment was blank for a long time. Oliver looked at Clara with surprise while she stared intently down, waiting for an answer. "Is this a different story?" he asked. Clara didn't look up. When Arthur went to Avalon, his sword was supposedly thrown back into the lake he got it from. The Lady of the Lake was supposed to be a magician who raised Lancelot, gave Excalibur to Arthur, and imprisoned Merlin. If that part of the legends is true, then we should be looking for the sword in lakes. This struck Oliver as being a fairly reasonable assumption. He too looked back down at the parchment and waited. It felt like a short eternity to Oliver, but the answer eventually began to appear in bits and pieces on the parchment. First came Humphrey's tidy script. "We do not know if the sword is at the next site or not. There is no specific record to suggest the sword returned to that place. However, we hope that, by understanding how the sword was made, we may better predict how we may discover it." This was followed by a flowing scroll that Oliver knew belonged to Archibald. The Lady of the Lake story is one of the few places where the wizarding and non-wizarding records diverge significantly. The Muggle records do indeed relate that the sword was thrown back into a lake. However, the wizarding records say that the sword was merrily given back to the Lady of the Lake. Clara looked confused. "How is that different?" she said aloud. She seized the pencil again, but before she could begin to write, more text was appearing. It was Humphrey's handwriting that appeared again. "Remember that the Lady of the Lake was an apprentice of Merlin named Vivienne. The non-magical records have thoroughly corrupted and misrepresented the relationship between them. Vivienne was a Muggle-born witch who was mentored by Merlin. She never lived in a lake, but rather she lived in a village that she hid by enchantment. The shallow valley that the town occupied was made to look like a body of water. Vivienne was sometimes seen coming and going, and as she was known to be able to perform magic, it was thought that she lived in an actual lake. Thus, she gained the name Lady of the Lake." Archibald's flowing script took over. "We are aware that Excalibur existed before Arthur claimed it. It is probable that it has appeared repeatedly throughout history by different names. There are many stories of swords with magical powers that kings were able to wield as they built, and maintained their kingdoms. We suspect that Merlin and Viviane traveled to Avalon as they knew it, to visit the place where Gladys Ferrerius had her forge. They must have been able to track down Excalibur in order to present it to Arthur after his first sword was broken. When Arthur was on his deathbed, Excalibur was returned to Viviane at the same time that she was taking Arthur across the sea to Avalon. Unfortunately, the biases of medieval writers have obscured the role that Viviane might have had in the court of King Arthur following the retirement of Merlin. There was a pause in the writing, and Clara hurriedly wrote, "What does that mean for our search?" The words appeared almost immediately. "The sword we are searching for is probably not in a lake." "That is a terrible joke," Oliver said. Chapter 15. From Camelot to Avalon. Oliver's thoughts were swimming with the information they'd taken in. By the looks of it, Clara's were, too. They had dashed off to catch a train north to Liverpool, so they had not really finished their conversation with Humphrey and Archibald. They needed to be on the move first and foremost. They could get more information later. They were fortunate to board a train that left Caerleon just after noon. They were facing a long ride north, and Oliver and Clara hoped to catch the last ferry of the day from Liverpool to Douglas. The train was full of travellers enjoying the warm summer weather. Oliver and Clara didn't dare bring out the parchment until they could find a less public environment. "Nothing seems to have changed," Clara said as she looked at the group of travellers chatting idly across the aisle from them. "They do not seem to know about the assassination yesterday." "I saw a newspaper in the last train station," Oliver said, and the front page was running a story on Irish Home Rule. "Well, that is an important issue," Clara ventured. "I have heard some at the university say that if the government cannot sort out the situation in Ulster, there could be a civil war." "It is hard to believe that we are facing the threats of a civil war and a war on the continent at the same time," Oliver said. They made a quick transfer in Hereford, but otherwise had an uninterrupted journey. Happily, the crowds thinned when they transferred, so Clara brought out the parchment and Humphrey and Archibald picked up their narrative again. They explained how Excalibur had been forged long before the time of King Arthur. Magical swords had appeared and disappeared many times throughout history. Many swords like Cleam Sale and Dienwyn were reputed to have magical powers similar to Excalibur. They could shine brightly, light on fire, or were otherwise exceptionally powerful weapons. It was more than probable that Excalibur had also come and gone several times under different names. Viviane and Merlin had clearly done the research to figure out how to obtain Excalibur. When Arthur had broken his own sword, the one he pulled from the stone, the one that had confirmed his right to rule, he had been presented with a new sword by Viviane. That sword had not been forged by the Lady of the Lake, so where had it come from? What had Viviane and Merlin learned to lead them to Excalibur? That was the reasoning for their trip to Peel Castle. The Isle of Man had a long magical history. An ancient school of magical healing was supposed to have existed there, and Archibald had dug up rumors in some very old wizarding sources that a forge run by a witch named Gladys Ferrerius was based there. Based on the accounts, legends, and rumors, the only location that really fit was the castle situated on St. Patrick's Isle on the western shore of the island. Oliver and Clara needed to retrace the footsteps of Viviane and Merlin. If they could find the forge, maybe they could discover the secret to getting the sword. As Archibald had explained to them, they couldn't count on the sword being tied to a location. The sword might be guarded by another test like they had faced in the round table room, or they might need to perform complicated magic to summon it, or they might need to break through powerful magical barriers to retrieve it. However the sword was hidden, they needed more information before they could continue their search. "It is fortunate that we found the shield as quickly as we did," Clara said, breaking Oliver's train of thought. "This was one of the last ferries out of the port today. If we had been delayed any more than we were, we might not have been able to get across until tomorrow." Oliver looked around. It was very late in the afternoon, and their ferry was steaming along, quickly carrying them towards the port of Douglas. I still do not fully understand what we are supposed to be looking for, Clara continued. Archibald kept mentioning this Gladys Ferrerius person, but I do not even know who she was supposed to be. I do not know much more than you, to be perfectly honest, Oliver admitted. I remember reading an account of her before I left Oxford, though. She was a witch and a blacksmith. She was so dedicated to her craft and so good at it that there was speculation she must have learned blacksmithing secrets from goblins. It is hard to know for sure, though, because she did not leave any records herself. Everything we know about her comes to us second or third hand. However, if anyone forged Excalibur, it is a good bet that it was her. She might be the only person who was not a goblin to ever have both the skill as a blacksmith and a witch to create a sword like that. And we are trying to rediscover her forge, Clara recited, her brows furrowed in concentration, because it should give us some sort of clue to how we should get Excalibur. Is that right? Well, Vivienne and Merlin might have gone there, so hopefully we will find whatever they found, Oliver said, shrugging. To be honest, I have no idea what to expect. I am not sure if we will find a complicated riddle to a medieval quest or a straightforward instruction to go to a specific place. I do not even know what this forge is supposed to look like. I have seen reproductions of forges from different eras, Clara said thoughtfully. They usually have the same basic elements: heat, metal, something to shape and cool it, of course. I have never seen one where magic was actually involved. You do not know that, Oliver said. There were plenty of witches and wizards who lived in non-magical communities. I would not be surprised if more than a few of them became blacksmiths. It does not mean they all created magical items, but they probably used magic to help improve their products. I am sure a few of them have been dug up and studied by archaeologists. Clara stared out at the waves for a minute. This just seems like it should be different, like it should be special. Everything we have seen up until now has been utterly unique and remarkable. Why should a forge belonging to a legendary witch, situated on an island that might have been the legendary Avalon, be any different? Oliver thought about it. I hope it is special, but your guesses are as good as mine right now. We will just have to get there and find whatever we can find. The rest of the trip passed quickly as they chatted. Clara retold a few of the tales around Excalibur while Oliver listened happily. Clara was a good storyteller, and Oliver felt as if Excalibur was somehow closer to them while he listened. Soon they were pulling into Douglas and disembarking into the city. Oliver found a guard and asked directions to the train station. They had to hurry, but they caught the 7:40 p.m. direct appeal with a few minutes to spare. As Oliver settled into his seat, across from Clara, he sighed deeply. He had been so immersed into their stories and speculations that Oliver had forgotten about the Black Hand. Humphrey had given them a report while they had been on the train to Liverpool. Apparently, nobody had seen or heard anything about their whereabouts since they vanished out of Serbia 4 days earlier. Oliver wasn't sure if he should be worried or comforted by the lack of news. On one hand, he felt as if the lack of news indicated that the Black Hand still hadn't made it to England yet. On the other hand, the lack of sightings or rumors coming from the continent meant that they were much more skilled at hiding and moving undetected than the ministry had anticipated. If they could cross all of Western Europe undetected, why couldn't they sneak into Britain as well? Oliver sank into his seat and stared out the window. He was starting to get tired. He had been on the go almost constantly since Friday morning. He and Clara had traveled hundreds of miles without magic, and Oliver was starting to feel like they were pushing their luck. How much longer could they really expect to stay ahead of the Black Hand? The train rocked back and forth methodically as the green landscape passed slowly by the window, and Oliver drifted off into a fitful sleep. He had a series of dreams where he was followed by shadowy figures that lurked just out of sight. He ran through streets and ducked into alleyways, but he couldn't shake them. They were always there behind him, following him, watching him. Oliver woke with a start. Clara was sitting across from him sipping a cup of tea. "Bad dreams?" she asked softly. "I guess," Oliver said, stretching his back. "I never sleep very well on trains." "I got a pot of tea for us and a box of biscuits. It was delivered only a few minutes ago, so the tea should still be hot." Clara pointed at a tray that had the tea and biscuits on it. "It should make you feel better." "Thanks," Oliver said, pouring out a cup for himself. "I had not realized how tired all of this has made me. We have done a lot in the past few days." "We really have," Clara agreed, setting her own cup down on the tray. "There was Merlin's cave, the burial at Stonehenge." Clara was counting them off on her hands. "The detour back through Oxford, then the trip to Wales to find the Round Table, and now we are here on the Isle of Man." "Where is here exactly?" Oliver asked, peering out the window at a green landscape. "We are only about halfway across the island," Clara informed him. "This train is very slow. I asked a steward about it, and he told me the train is going more slowly than usual. He thinks there is something on the tracks ahead of us. Even with this delay, we should still arrive by 9:00 p.m. "Well," Oliver said while stifling a yawn, "I cannot complain about the extra sleep." "I have also been thinking about that," Clara said, leaning forward a little. "I know you probably want to go straight to the castle to look around, but I think we should either set up camp or find somewhere to stay for the night. I think we could use the rest." "I am not sure," Oliver said, a note of real uncertainty in his voice. "It has been 4 full days since I set out from London. How long can we expect to keep up our search before we run into the Black Hand? It has been long enough that they should be in the country already." He paused, looked down at the floor, and then confessed his fears to Clara. "I was dreaming before that they were following behind us, out of sight, but always there. I am worried that the longer we take, the more likely it is they will catch up with us." Oliver looked back up at Clara, who was sitting quietly, watching him. She sighed softly and then spoke. "I have thought about that as well," she said quietly, "but we cannot let fear make our choices for us." She hesitated and then continued. "I wrote to Humphrey again while you slept. I kept the parchment in my bag," she explained by pointing to the leather bag strapped around her waist. "He told me that he has been keeping the ministry informed about our movements and findings. They have a team ready to come out to us, wherever we are, at a moment's notice. He also told me that the ministry has been keeping him informed about suspected movements of the Black Hand. The ministry thinks they have had a lot of trouble traveling across the continent because of the assassination. The Black Hand might be stuck in France right now. Humphrey said the French ministry was making travel there difficult because of everything that is going on." Oliver looked out the window. "I just feel uneasy about it." "I know," Clara said. "Right now, though, we do not know what we are looking for here. We need more information. The steward also told me that the castle will be closed for the night when we arrive. We should not exhaust ourselves by staying up all night to break into a castle and look for something we do not really know anything about. We can get up tomorrow and go in when it opens. We can ask around if there are any stories about a forge or magic. We are trained to do research and to discover truths that others are unable to find. Let us get up tomorrow and do that." Oliver knew that Clara was being sensible. They could go blundering around in the dark all night tonight, but everything told him that it wasn't going to help them find Gladys's forge. They needed another lead, like they'd had before to find the entrance to the Round Table. They needed to talk to someone local, someone who could tell them of any local rumors or legends. "All right," said Oliver. "Let us eat a good meal and get a good night's sleep. Maybe we can find an inn in town where we can start asking some questions. They might know of some old tales that would help us." Clara nodded and smiled. "Sounds good." The sun still hadn't quite disappeared properly when the train finally rolled into Peel. Oliver and Clara stepped out from the station into the dusky light and looked around. To their left, a long street seemed to run towards the ocean. Oliver could just make out the top of Peel Castle in the distance. To their right, Streets lined with houses and shops climbed into the town. Together they turned into the city, and soon they were swallowed up in the narrow streets. Oliver and Clara walked along past shops and houses for a while. They passed a 16th-century church and bell tower, which threatened to distract Clara until Oliver pulled her away, and were just about to turn down a street leading towards the castle when Clara looked up, made a soft "oh" of surprise, and pointed up the street. Oliver was caught off guard as he walked into Clara's outstretched arm. She had raised it so quickly and suddenly that Oliver nearly fell over trying to avoid hitting it with his face. "What?" he asked, a little hotly. "Look there," Clara said, lowering her arm. "Peel Castle Hotel. Maybe we should try there." Oliver looked up at a large 3-story facade facing straight out at them from a T-junction ahead of them. Even in the rapidly dwindling light of the evening, the name Peel Castle Hotel was visible in red lettering on the front of the building. He shrugged. It was as good a place as any to start out. He followed Clara a little ways up the street to the junction where the hotel was situated. They crossed over the street, and Clara led the way inside. Chapter 16. Stories and Rumors. The inside of the hotel was dimly lit by lanterns. Clara led the way through a small lobby to a desk and rang a bell that was perched on top of it. A moment later, a small, elderly woman appeared from a back room and approached the desk. "Good evening," she said in a voice that was surprisingly strong and clear. "How may I help you?" "Good evening," Clara replied. "I was wondering if you might have 2 rooms available. My associate and I have just arrived on short notice and were unable to make prior accommodations." The woman looked at them with narrowed eyes. "Yes," she said finally, "I do have a few rooms available. Please wait here a moment." She disappeared once again into the back room. Clara suddenly turned to Oliver. "My bag," she said urgently. "What about your bag?" Oliver replied, confused. "It is in the tent. In my case, is it not?" "Exactly," said Clara, looking worriedly back at the doorway where the old woman had disappeared. "I need it out, quickly. She will be suspicious if it looks like I don't have my own bag." Oliver suddenly realized what Clara meant. He and Clara were research partners, and that meant they would be expected to have their own separate luggage in their own separate rooms, for propriety's sake. Quickly he leaned down and popped open his case. He stuck his wand in and whispered, "A Keo luggage." Footsteps from behind the door told Oliver he needed to hurry. He reached in with his other hand and caught the handle of Clara's luggage as it zoomed up at him from the depths of the case. Quickly and as quietly as he could, he pulled it out and placed it near Clara's feet. Clara was already turning to greet the footsteps as they drew nearer. Oliver silently closed his own case and then straightened up. "Robert here will take your bags to your room," the woman said, gesturing to a freckly-faced teenager who had appeared behind her. "Please register here in the guest book for your rooms. Here is the standard fare per night spent. It includes meals served at 8:00 a.m. and 6:00 p.m. daily for guests of the hotel. You may settle your bill when you check out." Clara and Oliver signed her guest book and handed their luggage over to Robert. He took them with a short bow and looked back at the woman expectantly. The little woman consulted the guest book and then another book behind the counter before speaking. "Mr. Lacey will be in room 315 and Ms. Tippett will be in room 211. Thank you, Robert." "Right away, Mrs. Kelly," the boy responded, and he hurried away towards the stairs with the luggage. Mrs. Kelly watched Robert disappear up a set of stairs and then turned back to Oliver and Clara. "It will take Robert a few minutes to get your rooms ready for you. We had an unfortunate mishap with our laundry this afternoon, and our staff was unable to properly clean and prepare the open rooms for new arrivals. In the meantime, may I offer you tea or perhaps something else?" "That would be lovely," Clara said, smiling kindly. "We have been traveling all day, and a little something before we turn in for the night would be very welcome." Oliver's stomach made a loud gurgling noise. Mrs. Kelly looked at him in surprise. "Sorry," he said sheepishly. "I guess we have not eaten properly for a while. There was not enough time." Mrs. Kelly looked thoughtful. "By chance, my cook is still here tonight. We were playing cards after dinner. Perhaps she would be kind enough to make a few sandwiches for you." "We do not want to inconvenience anyone," Oliver said hurriedly. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Kelly sternly, but her face broke into a smile. "Go right through those doors into the dining area. I will meet you there in just a moment." Oliver and Clara turned and walked across the lobby towards the dining area, while Mrs. Kelly went the other direction into her back room. They turned through a set of double doors into a room with a large number of tables spaced out in it. Here and there, people were sitting at them, drinking alone or in small groups. A low buzz of idle conversation filled the air. They chose an empty table that looked to be close to the kitchen and sat down. The room had a whiff of antique building, but the walls, floors, and tables were clean and tidy. A few minutes later, Mrs. Kelly came bustling in with a tea tray and a few sandwiches. She set them down on the table and said, "There you are. Is there anything else I can get you?" "No, thank you," Clara responded. "Perhaps you would like to join us, though. If it is not too inconvenient to you, maybe you could tell us a little about the local area." Mrs. Kelly nodded. "Well, of course," she said, taking an empty seat. "What brings you to Peel?" Clara looked at Oliver thoughtfully for a moment before turning back to Mrs. Kelly. "We are working on a research project. I am based at Oxford University, and Oliver is a very talented independent researcher whose company is leading the project. Right now, we are looking into some of the history of Peel Castle." Mrs. Kelly looked surprised. "Well, that explains your arrival. It is not very common for tourists to arrive out of the blue on a Monday night." Oliver chuckled. "No, I guess it would not be." "How long will you be here then?" she asked. "We are not sure yet," Clara answered. "It depends on what we learn about the castle." "Well, I guess all the locals know a bit about the castle. What is it in particular that interests you about it?" Mrs. Kelly asked them. Oliver leaned back in his chair. "Well, to start with, we are interested in a basic understanding of the site. We are looking at the questions of who built it, when did they do it, and what was it used for. We were not expecting to be coming here, so we are not as prepared as we would like to be." Clara jumped in, explaining, "We are working with some historians who are still in the libraries in Oxford. We have been corresponding with them, and they sent us out here without the usual background information to help us. It caught us a little off guard." Mrs. Kelly nodded. "Of course, my dear. Well, I can tell you a bit. Mind, it is nothing that the guides at the castle would not be able to tell you. There is really a lot of work that has been done at the castle already." "That is fine," said Clara quickly. "We would love to hear you tell it." "I know that the castle was built in stages," Mrs. Kelly started. "As you probably know, the castle is built on St. Patrick's Isle, only connected to the rest of the town by a causeway. It guards the entrance to the town and our harbour. It is a very strong site for a fortification. There were old Celtic buildings on the isle as far back as anyone knows. I have heard tell that they were religious buildings, but in any case, the first part of the castle proper was built by the Vikings in the 1200s. The Viking king had a funny name, Magnum or Mangum or something similar. I can never remember it. After the Vikings all converted to the Christian faith, they built the Cathedral of St. German. That was the see of the Soda and Man diocese for a long time. The castle got a lot of use up until about 50 or 60 years ago. I remember when I was a young girl, they added new fortifications to it, but eventually they moved out, and it has fallen into ruin pretty quickly since then." "And what about the lore of the castle?" Oliver asked, leaning forward. "Are there any stories that the guides would not tell us? Old rumors or legends that have been passed down?" Mrs. Kelly looked over at Oliver with interest. "Oh, yes. They're Aramony, but my cook is actually very knowledgeable about the castle. She knows much more than I do. Her late husband was a local historian and guide." Let me go get her. I know she was just wrapping up in the kitchen. She stood up and hurried back towards the kitchen. Clara turned to Oliver. What do you think? It is promising, Oliver said. There is a legacy of different groups building there. It is obviously a strong defensive site, but there are one or two religious sites there too, built by different groups. That makes me think that there must have been something special about the place. Something more than just a good place to build a castle. Clara finished off her sandwich and said, That makes sense. What would any of those groups have to do with Gladys, though? I have no idea, Oliver replied truthfully. Maybe nothing at all. But they might have built on top of other pre-existing magical sites, preserving their legacy. If they did not understand the magic, they might call it a sacred site and build a church on it. Clara was about to respond when Mrs. Kelly came bustling out of the kitchens with another woman who was squat and round. Mr. Lacey, Miss Tippet, please meet Mrs. Thomas, an old friend of mine and a wonderful cook. Mrs. Thomas smiled and nodded at Oliver and Clara as they both said, Pleased to meet you. She and Mrs. Kelly sat down at the table. Mrs. Kelly produced a bottle of brandy and glasses. If you have finished with your sandwiches, I hope you will enjoy a bit of this with us, she said with a grin. Oliver and Clara both nodded their agreement. Now, Maggie, Mrs. Kelly said, pouring out glasses of brandy and passing them around, these fine young guests are doing research into the history of Peel Castle. I have given them some of the major points, but you know I am no great shakes at remembering all the details. And they were asking for some of the local legends around the castle. You are the best storyteller on the Isle, so naturally I thought you had better come talk to them. Mrs. Thomas took a sip of her brandy. What is it you are looking for? She asked them. It is fairly unusual for a couple of historians to show up not knowing about the history of a place like Peel and asking about the local legends, she finished shrewdly. Our project is fairly unusual, Oliver conceded. We have been traveling the countryside, hunting down legends in very real places. Every story begins somewhere, and we are trying to get to the heart of some of them. We do not know as much as we would like about Peel Castle, because the legend that brought us here is not very specific. That is part of what makes our task so difficult, Clara explained. Which legend did bring you here? Mrs. Kelly asked. It is the legend of King Arthur, Oliver answered simply. Mrs. Kelly furrowed her brow, but Mrs. Thomas nodded. Presumably you had to come quickly because you were already out in the field, and you have to cover as much ground as possible before your funding runs out, Mrs. Thomas asked. Actually, yes, Clara said. There is never enough money for academics who are trying to learn about and preserve our culture. Mrs. Thomas nodded again. My late husband always suffered from a lack of funding. He was a bright man, hard-working and dedicated, but he never had the resources he needed to do his work properly. It is a story that is all too familiar to us, Clara said, while Oliver nodded his agreement. Mrs. Thomas took another sip from her glass of brandy. I do not know too much about the ties of the legend of King Arthur to the Isle of Man. I understand it has been suggested that this might be the Isle of Avalon, but I do not know of any stories that could really confirm it. But the Isle of Man and Peel Castle in particular are strange places. A hush fell over the table as they listened to Mrs. Thomas begin to speak. The castle has been haunted for longer than anyone knows by the apparition of Mardi Dehu. It is a large black dog with long, shaggy hair that used to appear in the rooms when the castle was well used. It was seen in the guard chamber so often, laying down by the fire that the soldiers genuinely claimed to be used to it. The soldiers had nearly lost all fear of the dog when one guard went alone to lock up the castle. On the course of his duties, he had to pass along a particular passage that Mardi Dehu was known to haunt. The soldiers did not fear the ghost outright, however. They always performed the duty of locking up in pairs because they had to use this very passage. Despite being accustomed to the dog, they retained an uneasiness about encountering it alone. This guard, however, proclaimed his lack of fear of the spectral being and set off into the castle to perform the night's duties. The guard had just vanished from sight when the other soldiers heard noises from the passage. They were all too afraid to go investigate, so they waited. When the lone guard reappeared, not having completed his duty, he was beaten and bruised and so frightened that he was unable to speak. The man, who had been strong and brave, collapsed into a chair and died 3 days later. He never once was able to speak or tell the tale of what he had seen. The remaining soldiers sealed up that passageway and built another so they could avoid the ghostly dog. There have been occasional sightings since then, but never as regular as the soldiers used to experience. When was this supposed to have happened? Clara asked in a hushed tone. It is hard to say, Mrs. Thomas answered. The story is at least as old as the middle 1600s, but it is possible that it existed far before then. It could have started amongst the guards in the days of Magnus Barefoot, the Viking king who first built the castle. That is interesting, Oliver said, sitting forward in his chair. I am very curious about the heritage of Peel Castle as a special or even a sacred place. Is there anything more you can tell me about that? There are the ruined remains of a cathedral on the Isle, the Cathedral of St. German, as you may have already heard. Mrs. Thomas looked at Mrs. Kelly, who nodded vigorously. And of course, before that, the old Celtic buildings were religious as well. There are crypts and graves located on the Isle, beneath the cathedral. Yes, it is an uncommonly religious spot. Mrs. Thomas looked at Oliver, perhaps quizzically, before continuing. It is said that the Isle is the place where St. Patrick himself first set foot on the Isle of Man. That is why it bears his name to this day. But there is evidence that people have lived here around Peel, and on that little island, for generations before that. The legends say that there were healers of extraordinary skill and power in Avalon, Clara said. Is there anything here that might tie in with that? I do not know of any healings, but there have been churches on that isle for nearly 1,000 years or more. The Celts were there, and then the Christians. I would guess there are probably some miracles that have been lost to history, Mrs. Thomas said. I cannot tell you why so many religious buildings were built in so inaccessible a place. That land is certainly not sacred to the Manx, whatever it was that first made St. Patrick's Isle special has been lost to time, but it is clear to me that the Isle has always been more than just a good location to build a castle. Clara and Oliver had continued to question Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Kelly into the night. The two women had become increasingly talkative as the bottle of brandy became lighter and lighter. They were an excellent source of information about the local legends and rumors. Oliver had hoped that something would definitively connect Peel back to the Arthurian legends or to Gladys and her magical forge, but he was slightly disappointed by what he heard. The women knew enough stories to fill a library, but none of them really confirmed Peel as the site of a magical forge or the mystical location of Avalon. The only thing they couldn't explain was why St. Patrick's Isle had been the home to so many religious buildings. There was something that had made the little island special to different groups of people for thousands of years, but nobody seemed to know what it was. Eventually, the bottle of brandy was empty, and the group broke up for the night. Oliver and Clara climbed the stairs towards their rooms. Clara turned left off the second floor towards hers, while Oliver climbed the last flight up to his room. A sign pointed him to the right, and at the end of the hall he found his room marked with tarnished brass numbers on the door. He pulled out a key that Mrs. Kelly had given him when they checked in and opened the door. The room was small but comfortable. His traveling case was laying on the foot of his bed waiting for him. Oliver changed and fell into bed. There was a lot of work left to do. Chapter 17. Castles and Churches. Oliver woke and dressed the next morning. The clerk next to the bed told him breakfast was starting, so he hurried downstairs towards the dining room. When he walked through the double doors, he found Clara already sitting at one of the tables. She was eating some toast and reading a letter. Oliver went to get himself some eggs and juice before sitting next to Clara. Good morning, Clara said when he sat down. Morning, Oliver replied. Been down here long? A bit, Clara said. I got up to talk with the morning staff about a visit to the castle. They recommended that we take a guided tour the first time through. That should help us get the lay of the whole site. That is a good recommendation, Oliver said between bites of his fried eggs. That should really help us narrow down our search area for the forge, if it is there. Clara nodded. Good, it is settled then. Once you finish your breakfast, we will walk down to the castle and sign up for a guided tour. Who is the letter from? Oliver asked, pointing to the letter in her hand. It is from my family, Clara said. They want to know if I arrived safely with my uncle. I guess it arrived yesterday. It seems like we left him an age ago, but it has only been a few days. I know, Oliver said. We have done so much and travelled so far. Stonehenge, Oxford, Wales, and now the Isle of Man. It is no wonder I feel so tired, Clara said. We have fit a week's worth of work into a few days. Just out of curiosity, Oliver said, how did the letter come to you? Did the post owl bring it to your window, or did it leave it with the mail for the staff to find? Can it do that? Clara asked. I would think it would have to be very clever to leave it with the rest of the Daily Mail. No, it brought it to my window early this morning. That was one of the reasons I was up so early. An owl should appear for your return letter tomorrow, Oliver reminded her. It will, Clara said. This one had a little form for me to fill out so I can schedule the responses. Tomorrow seems as good a day as any, though. Oliver ate the rest of his breakfast quickly, and then he and Clara set off for the castle. It was a short walk down to the beachfront, over a bridge at the entrance to a marina, and then across the causeway that connected St. Patrick's Isle, where Peel Castle was built, to the rest of the Isle of Man. A road led around the exterior of the castle until they came to an entrance marked with a sign. They walked up a short set of stairs into a small entrance chamber. A few receptionists were seated behind a long desk, and one of them greeted them. They made arrangements for a guided tour and paid the receptionist a small fee for the entrance and tour. The receptionist disappeared to call for one of the guides, and just a few moments later reappeared with a balding, middle-aged man. Welcome to Peel Castle, he said. My name is Dennis, and I will be your guide today. Dennis led them through the castle and into what looked like a large open field in the middle of the walls. Much of the structure has collapsed over the years, and this thick carpet of grass now covers the area, he explained, a little lamely. Dennis turned out to be a good, albeit rather dry, source of information. He covered the site thoroughly, explaining the purpose of many of the structures and sharing some facts about them. He did this in a very rehearsed way. Dennis meandered here and there across the little island, pointing to bits of the architecture or battlements and explaining why they really were very interesting. Oliver and Clara followed closely, taking notes occasionally and asking questions, trying to tease any useful information out of their guide. Dennis, however, could not be deceived into deviating from his script. Finally, as they were nearing the end of their tour, walking back towards a guardhouse, Clara spoke up and said, Before we came, we heard some stories about a ghost named Marty Dehu. Is there anything else you can tell us about it? Maybe where it was supposed to have haunted? Dennis looked at Clara and raised an eyebrow. That story is very well known around town. It has, of course, been embellished, as all legends are. I presume you heard the story somewhere in town. Clara nodded. Well then, Dennis continued, I doubt that I can give you any additional information on the legend. There is no accepted true version of Marty Dehu or the events recounted in the legend. There has not been a sighting here at this castle since the death of the guard. Dennis looked at Clara and then over to Oliver. I pray you are not hoping for some sighting of the thing. I personally have spent many days and nights here and have not had any experience that is the least bit strange. I personally do not believe the dog or the soldiers ever existed. Rather, it was most likely a cautionary tale passed around amongst the soldiers about the dangers of not fulfilling their duties exactly as they were prescribed. It preyed on the superstitious and uneducated. Clara's eyes got wide. Oh, we do not believe in ghosts. We just thought it was an interesting addition to the local culture. Oliver shrugged and made a noncommittal sort of noise as Dennis looked over at him. Right, said Dennis. It is a popular tale for parents to tell their children. Were there any other questions before we end our tour? Yes, Oliver said. We understand that there were some religious buildings here before the castle was built. Can you tell us more about them? Certainly, Dennis said. The Celts built monastic buildings on the Isle, possibly as late as the 7th century. There is evidence that this area was permanently inhabited much earlier than that, and the legends say that St. Patrick landed here in 441. And how do we know about the Celtic buildings? Oliver pressed. The castle was built over the top of them, was it not? Not entirely, Dennis replied. There are marker stones and ruins that were found all around the site, and the round tower just over there is a striking feature of the Celtic style of construction, except of course for the battlements that were added later. Oliver kept pressing. Do you think that this island became special to its inhabitants, that they built churches and monasteries here because St. Patrick might have come here? Or do you think that there is something else which made this location so desirable as a place of worship? Dennis looked interested in the question. He didn't answer right away. He seemed to be pondering what he wanted to say. That is a really good question, he finally said. I think the answer to both of your questions is yes. Clara looked puzzled, and Dennis continued. I think St. Patrick's tie to this spot has made it holy to Christians, but there were people here before that time. This was not an easy place to get to before the causeway was built. It has qualities which make it valuable as a place of defense, but impractical as a place of habitation. The pagan inhabitants of this little isle, as far as we know, lived here for many years without building a defensive structure. In my opinion, there must have been something special about this spot to them. That may possibly be what drew St. Patrick here in the first place. Oliver and Clara thanked Dennis for his time and information, and the guide set off once again for the entrance. The tour had taken most of the morning, and Oliver was starting to feel hungry, so the pair decided to walk back to town for lunch. They could discuss what they had learned and decide what to do next. As they were crossing the bridge back into town, Oliver looked over at Clara and asked, Do you really not believe in ghosts? Clara looked taken aback at the question. Do you? She retorted. Of course, said Oliver. I know a few personally. Clara actually stopped dead in the middle of the bridge, and a child walking with her mother behind them collided into Clara's back. Sorry, Clara called after them as they stepped around her and walked off huffily. She turned to Oliver. You know a few personally. Well, maybe I should say I knew them, Oliver mused. It is hard to correspond with a ghost. They do not change very much, though, so I guess I know them about as well as you can. What are you talking about? Clara asked. Well, wizards who die can choose to come back as ghosts, Oliver explained. Most do not, though. It is pretty rare, but some choose to exist as a ghost when they want to haunt someone or they were exceptionally frightened of death. Clara looked at Oliver like he was just a little bit mad. It is not a popular option, Oliver said, because once you become a ghost, you cannot ever move on. You get stuck like that. And ghosts are really just like imprints or echoes of who the person was, but they are not quite the full thing. You and I, we can learn and grow and change from our experiences, but a ghost who will be around forever, although they can learn new names or have opinions on new events, is not able to change. They will always sort of be stuck as who they were when they died. Could a ghost kill Somione? Clara asked. There are rumors of some violent spirits around Britain, Oliver admitted. Those are mostly just rumors, though. I have never known of anyone to actually encounter one. You just end up hearing the stories. Largely, ghosts cannot really do anything to you. It feels cold when they walk through you, but beyond scaring you to death, they do not hurt you, and most would not do anything to you even if they could. Poltergeists are a little different, but there are a lot fewer of them. Clara was quiet for a minute, and they walked in silence while she took that new bit of information in. Finally, she spoke again. What about animals? Can they become ghosts? You mean Mardi Dihu, right? Oliver glanced sideways at Clara, who nodded. The short answer is yes. Some animals can become ghosts. Clara had a slightly exasperated look in her eyes. And? She prompted. What? Oliver asked, genuinely not sure what Clara was getting at. This is a place with a lot of history. I am surprised there are not more ghosts here. Come to it, they might have been helpful if there were some. They could have told us more of the magical history here. You said that only wizards could become ghosts, Clara pushed back. How does an animal become a ghost? I did not say Thattenly wizards could become ghosts. They just have the choice, Oliver corrected. Animals can sometimes become ghosts if they themselves are magical or if they live in the company of a witch or wizard. So, what you are telling me, Clara started summarizing, is that the presence of ghosts, especially an animal ghost, is evidence of magic. Definitely, said Oliver. However, in a place as old as this, there are bound to be a few ghosts hanging around. It does not mean any of them know anything, and it certainly is not confirmation that Avalon or Gladys's forge were here. Oliver seemed to have arrived at Clara's point because she looked surprised and said, But the existence of a ghost proves that there was magic here, does it not? It does, Oliver said, but whoever that was could have been here at any time before that legend started. It was sometime in the 1600s, right? Clara nodded. So, they lived and died before that. Witches and wizards are adept at hiding. Someone easily could have come here with the Vikings, or later. I guess, Clara admitted, trailing off. They walked in silence for a while, combing the roads near the beachfront for a lunch spot. Eventually, they found a small restaurant and stepped inside. The sun flooded in through large windows at the front of the restaurant, so Oliver and Clara found an open table in the sunlight and settled in. As they ate their way through some of the restaurant's pies, Oliver turned the conversation back to the castle. What do you think about what we saw today? He asked, reaching for a glass of lemonade. It looks like a pretty normal castle with a pretty normal church in it to me, Clara said. I did not see or feel anything out of the ordinary. I did not notice anything either, Oliver said. There were no noticeable traces of magic around anything that we saw. Traces of magic? Clara asked. Well, powerful magic always leaves traces, Oliver explained. They are small sort of signs that tell you that magic was performed there, even if it has been hidden. It is not a physical marking like we found at Stonehenge, he added. Most often it is more similar to the tingling in the air we felt back at Merlin's cave, although that one was not very subtle. Usually you have to really pay attention or you might miss them altogether. How do you find them if they are so subtle? Clara pressed. By paying attention, Oliver replied. More often, you feel the magical traces inside of you, rather than it being anything you can see or hear. Oliver took another swig of his lemonade and continued. The real question we need to answer is, what do we do next? I think we need to keep exploring the castle, Clara said. We did not really get a chance to fully explore some of the places he showed us. We barely spent any time at all inside the ruined cathedral. I agree, Oliver said, and we did not get a chance to really look for traces of magic, since we were so occupied with the guide and his information. So we should go back on our own and really comb through the site, Clara summarized. We should also write to Humphrey and see if he can dig up anything else for us, Oliver said. Maybe there is something more he can find for us that will help us hone in on this forge. Good idea, Clara said. I should have thought of that. She reached into the small leather bag tied around her waist and retrieved the enchanted parchment and a pencil. Looking around to make sure nobody was watching, she wrote out a quick summary of what they had learned and seen. She described their plan for the rest of the afternoon and wrote out a request that Archibald and Humphrey look for anything that might help them locate the forge. They would report on their progress again in the evening and discuss anything that Humphrey might have found. Once she finished writing, Clara folded the parchment back up and stuffed it with the pencil back in her bag. She looked across the table at Oliver and said, "Should we go?" Oliver nodded, so they got up, paid for their lunch, and walked back out into the sunny afternoon. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the castle, going through the site. They spent most of their efforts examining the cathedral, and by late afternoon, as large clouds drifted lazily across the sky, they hadn't found anything. Oliver occasionally made forays out from the cathedral into the rest of the castle grounds, but inevitably he was drawn back to it. As Clara kept putting it, if something was here, they would not have built a guardhouse or a big tower over it. They would have built a church for it. Oliver found that reasoning to be very compelling. Humphrey and Archibald had seemed so sure when they sent them out here. Peel Castle, St. Patrick's Isle, was supposed to be the home of Avalon and the site of Gladys Ferrerius's forge, but so far they had been utterly unable to find anything. He wanted to feel frustrated about it, but there was this nagging little voice just in the back of his mind. It kept telling him that he shouldn't expect it to be easy to find the forge. He and Clara had been very fortunate so far. They had found the other artifacts so quickly and so easily they were bound to get stuck on something. It made sense that the sword, being so valuable, would be the most difficult to find. Clara, for her part, seemed to become more and more excited and pleased the more difficult their task seemed to get. Her optimism had become strangely unshakable over the course of the afternoon, but Oliver couldn't understand why. A drizzle had started to fall in the early evening, and they were walking back to their hotel, wet and tired. Yet Clara was almost bouncing with conviction that they were on the cusp of discovery. "How can you be so confident that we are going to succeed here?" Oliver finally asked. "Archaeology is a long, hard, and very slow process," she said. "It usually takes years of research and backbreaking work to uncover anything significant. We have magic on our side, so by comparison, when we do find something it will have been almost incomprehensibly faster and easier." "Maybe," said Oliver, "but we are looking for something hidden by magic, too, and right now, we do not have any real leads. We're not any closer to finding anything than we were when we got here. Magic has not changed that, and without new clues, magic will not change it." Clara seemed utterly unfazed by this. "I am not scared of the work, Oliver," she said. "I am sure Humphrey will have something for us. Maybe we can talk to Mrs. Kelly or Mrs. Thomas again. Or maybe I should go find a local priest who can tell us more about the history and significance of the church. There is probably a local library I can go to for archived accounts and histories of the castle. There are so many ways we might figure this out. Do not get discouraged now. We have only just started." Oliver found Clara's optimism a little bit contagious. Maybe it was the combination of Clara's positive attitude and the little voice in the back of his mind that staved off his frustration, but he held real hope that Humphrey would write to them with the missing piece of the puzzle. Oliver and Clara stayed up late into the night, seated at one of Mrs. Kelly's dining tables and huddled over their parchment. They described the castle site as thoroughly as they could to Humphrey and Archibald. Oliver tried to hide his growing fear and frustration at not having found anything, but he couldn't help but give a blunt assessment of the utter lack of evidence for magical occupation. Clara remained positive, and she was supported by the two academic wizards. They remained unflappably convinced that Peel Castle was the correct location. "Unfortunately," as they wrote, "we have not been able to uncover any first-person accounts of Gladys's forge, Avalon, or even Peel Castle, yet. For the time being, we are still operating in the realms of rumor and conjecture." That wasn't especially comforting to Oliver. The next day passed by in much the same way as the previous. Clara rose early again and disappeared to go interview local priests and check in at a local library. Oliver went back to the castle to continue looking around and hunting for traces of magic. He and Clara hoped that a subtle use of the Specialty's Reveille spell might bring out the magic they were hunting. They agreed that they would meet up in town for lunch to report on their progress. Oliver spent the morning walking back and forth across the castle grounds. He had his wand hidden inside a pocket of his jacket where he could hold on to it and cast his Reveille spell without being seen. To his disappointment, but not his surprise, his search turned up nothing. He tried talking to another guide about the ruined cathedral inside the castle walls. The church dedicated to St. German had fallen into disrepair many years prior. Repairs were suggested as late as 1877, but the costs being prohibitive, they were never carried out, and the once majestic cathedral was left as a ruin. It was known that a crypt lay beneath the ruin, and some local church officials had been buried there. Oliver found this information very interesting, but also distinctly unhelpful. It reinforced the idea that there was something on St. Patrick's Isle to find, but it wasn't helping him get any closer to finding it. As the morning wore on towards noon, Oliver decided to head back into town. He wasn't surprised that he hadn't found anything, but he hoped that Clara might have dug up some new information to reinvigorate their search. It was a short walk to the restaurant they'd agreed to meet at, and Oliver knew he was early, so he ordered a drink and sat down to wait. He was surprised, though, when Clara materialized off the street just a few minutes after he sat down. "You are early," Oliver said. "So are you," Clara replied. "My luck was pretty poor this morning," Oliver explained a little sheepishly. "I could not find anything or turn anything up with revealing spells, so I finished up and walked over. But I only just sat down." "I did not find anything new about the castle or the church, either," Clara said. "But I was asking the local priests about special locations, and they gave me a place to go look at. It is called Spewit Vane, and there is a waterfall and a church there in a glen. They say it is only supposed to be an hour's ride up the coast by bicycle." "I guess we can head up there this afternoon," Oliver said. "Getting away from the castle for a bit might help us clear our minds." "It will feel good to do something different," Clara said. "I think we can rent the bicycles from Mrs. Kelly so we can head back over there after lunch." When lunch had ended, the pair hurried back to the hotel. The hotel staff procured a couple of bicycles and a local map to help them out, and Oliver and Clara were on their way. They rode north out of town on a road that ran along the shore. They passed through neat fields where farmers tended their crops or else sheep grazed lazily. A few houses dotted a landscape that was otherwise green and empty. Eventually, after nearly an hour, they arrived at a wooded area that extended in a thin line inland from the coast. Clara consulted the directions they had received and said, "This must be it." A narrow path led into it from the road. They stashed their bikes against some trees and set off along the path. They could hear the sound of rushing water somewhere out in front of them, and they followed it. The path was heavily rutted, but it was clear of debris, and they had no trouble following it deep into the wood. Soon they came across a stream. They walked along it only a short ways before they crossed a narrow and rickety bridge. Beyond this was a steep set of steps that led down into a low valley and set them at the base of a small, three-tier waterfall. "This is incredible," Clara said softly. "Look at this place." Oliver agreed. It was a beautiful scene. The waterfall cascaded gently down moss-covered rocks surrounded by lush green foliage. At the base, it gathered into a small, shallow pool. "It feels mystical," Clara said, "like the type of grove fairies and nymphs would live in from the old stories. This could be the goal in one of those ancient quests where the quester would gain wisdom if they could find and drink from a magical pool." Oliver was turning slowly on the spot, but at those words he spun quickly back. "What was that you said?" "It is like the objective of a quest, where drinking the water from the pool grants you wisdom," Clara said, confused. "Before that," Oliver said, "about it feeling like a mystical place." Oh, Clara said. It does it not? I mean, it is a pretty place, but do you feel it? It is not like the rest of the wood around it. Traces of magic, Oliver said softly. Remember what Humphrey and Archibald told us when they asked us to come here. They said there was supposed to be an ancient magical school of healing here. What if it was somewhere near here? Clara looked surprised. I forgot about that. I was so caught up in our search at the castle. Me too, Oliver said. But finding the school would help validate the reasoning that brought us here. How do we find it? Clara asked. It could be anywhere, right? It could be, Oliver admitted. But this pool and the feeling you have right now suggest that it is not just anywhere, but rather it is somewhere nearby. I think we should just keep going down the glen. Oliver led the way as they worked their way down the glen on a path that seemed to have been well used once, but had recently started to be reclaimed by the wood. They walked along in silence, looking around for any sign of a building or the remains of one. They hadn't walked very far when they came to a sort of clearing. Looking around the clearing, they could see small mounds in places with exposed rocks. Clara walked towards one of them in a corner of the clearing. Oliver, she said excitedly, these are ruins. Look, they have been excavated. You can see the way everything has been cleaned out to expose the layout of this structure. It is not terribly overgrown either, so it must have been recently done. Oliver stepped over the low remains of a wall so that he stood squarely inside the little ruin. It is very strange, he said. Clara didn't seem to hear him. She was hurrying across the clearing towards a slightly larger ruin. Yes, she hollered back. Look at that. There are the remains of the walls there and there. Oliver walked over. It is not very big, he said. Can you tell what it might have been? I have no idea, Clara said. These two ruins are obviously connected, though. They are the only thing around. Could it be the school? It seems a little small for a school, Oliver said. And magical ruins do not usually deteriorate the same way Muggle ruins do. And if any excavations here had turned up magical artifacts, Humphrey would have known about it and told us. Yet, he trailed off. It seemed all wrong, but Oliver had a feeling that he was missing something. They were in the middle of a wood, having found a remarkable waterfall, and now they had come across a set of ruined structures. What is magical healing like? Clara asked. Are there special spells that you have to learn? There are a few, Oliver answered distractedly. Sometimes healers use spells to counteract the damage done by other spells, but most healing is done through the use of magical plants and potions. Potions and plants, that was it. A successful healer has a comprehensive knowledge of herbology and potion making, Oliver said, pieces suddenly falling into place in his mind. So a glen and wooded area like this would have been an ideal place for a school. They would have been able to grow and tend to magical plants without anyone accidentally coming across them. And they would have been able to practice brewing potions in a place that was safely away from anyone else as well. But you said magical ruins didn't usually deteriorate the same way as non-magical buildings do, Clara said. And you said if anything magical had been found here, that Humphrey would have known about it. Unless there was nothing to find, Oliver said. What if the school had moved on? What if the building itself was not magical and everything else had been cleaned up? If there were no magical artifacts here, Humphrey never could have known about it. What about the size? It is not very big, Clara pointed out. There are not that many witches and wizards, Oliver quickly responded. Not all of us want to become healers, and there are a lot fewer of us who are talented enough to even do it. Now that I really think about it, I doubt the school ever had to be very big. Clara just looked at Oliver. Finally, she asked, Do you really think this is it? It is a good candidate, Oliver said. I think we should go ask Mrs. Kelly and Mrs. Thomas to see if they know anything about this. Maybe they can tell us what happened here. Clara nodded. More research. The ride back down the coast didn't seem to take as long. Maybe it was the excitement of feeling like they had made a breakthrough, or maybe it was the golden light of the evening as the sun prepared to set. But Oliver felt as though the distance glided by effortlessly beneath the tires of his borrowed bicycle. In what felt like no time at all, they were riding back into Peel and climbing the hill back to their hotel. They returned their bicycles to a teenage boy who was working behind the front desk and turned in the direction of the dining room. They had arrived in time for dinner, which was a lively affair. They sat in the crowded dining room and took in Mrs. Thomas's highly satisfactory cooking. They had to wait for all the hotel's guests to filter through before they could get a chance to talk to Mrs. Thomas, but they were lucky enough to catch Mrs. Kelly working her way through the tables. "Well, hello, dears," she said. "Did you make any progress today?" "We might have," Oliver said. "We are not really sure what to make of it yet." "Do you have a minute to talk after dinner is over?" Clara asked. "Oliver and I went to the most extraordinary place today, and we were wondering if you and Mrs. Thomas might be able to tell us a little more about it. You were both so helpful last time we had questions." Mrs. Kelly blushed a little. "I am sure that Mrs. Thomas and I can find a little time to sit with you again tonight, but it will have to wait until after we have cleared everything away from dinner." "Of course," Oliver said. "We do not wish to inconvenience you." "We are really very grateful to you," Clara added quickly. "We do not mind waiting." Mrs. Kelly smiled a little more widely at them and set off, winding her way through the other tables and guests. "How do you want to do this?" Clara asked softly, leaning across the table a little. "We cannot give away what we are actually doing." "True," Oliver said. "I want to bring up the ruin we found and see if there is any connection to the castle ruins. I think we can describe the waterfall and the rest of the glen as a very beautiful spot, but I want to try to avoid leading them into our descriptions. I want to avoid leading Mrs. Kelly and Mrs. Thomas into describing that area as magical or special. If they feel that is special, I would like for them to bring it up on their own." Clara nodded. "We can do that. Do we need to justify it as a connection to King Arthur?" "I do not think so," Oliver said thoughtfully. "It can be another part of the island's landscape that helps build the background of the legend." "Or maybe today we're just curious tourists," Clara suggested. "Even better," Oliver said, nodding. The dining area emptied slowly. Patrons and guests lingered over drinks, talking and laughing into the night. Eventually, however, Mrs. Thomas emerged from the kitchen and made her way over to Oliver and Clara. "Hello again, my dears," she said kindly as she sat down. "Winola told me that you had an adventure today. She will be along shortly. She just has a few patrons left who need drinks." "Hello, Mrs. Thomas," Clara said brightly. "We went out for a little sightseeing today, just to clear our heads a little bit." "It is a beautiful countryside," Oliver added, "and unfortunately we are always very curious." "I do not doubt it," Mrs. Thomas said with a chuckle. While they were talking, Mrs. Kelly had finished serving the last few guests and started making her way over. "Ah, Maggie, you are already out here," she said as she sat down, plopping a bottle of brandy onto the table. She turned to face Oliver and Clara. "So tell us, what have you been up to?" "We cycled out to Spewit Vane this afternoon," Clara started. "We heard about the waterfall there, so we decided to go see it," Oliver explained. "But while we were there, we stumbled onto some ruins," Clara continued. "We were hoping you could tell us more about them." Mrs. Kelly, who had been pouring brandy into 4 glasses, looked up. "Oh, well, that would be the Spewit Vane Chapel, of course. It is an old ruin. I believe it was an old keel dedicated to St. Patrick, if my memory serves," Mrs. Thomas said, taking up her glass of brandy. "Sorry," Oliver interrupted. "A keel." "A keel is an old primitive Christian chapel," Mrs. Kelly said, knowledgeably. "Typically, they predate the 12th century," Mrs. Thomas elaborated. "Local priests would build them and operate them for the local families. They would live there in the keel in a semi-solitary state. They were independent from any sort of larger monasteries, and it made for a rather austere lifestyle." "Oh," Clara said. So those ruins are rather old if they predate the 1100s. Yes, very much so, Mrs. Thomas said. I believe that particular keel became disused after the local priest lost track of the day and was late to his service. In a hurry to make up for his mistake, he tripped and fell and was drowned in the stream. Or at least, that is the story they tell us. Oliver shook his head. That seems almost unbelievable. Mrs. Kelly nodded in agreement. It is a local story that is probably kept alive because it is so extraordinary. It seemed a very small site to me, Clara said. Hardly large enough for a church. Yes, replied Mrs. Thomas. I believe they were usually small, but the one at Spewit Vane is actually somewhat larger than average. That sounds right, Mrs. Kelly. I can remember going out to the glen as a young girl. It felt different to me then. I could never quite figure it out, but there was something different about it. Not good or bad, but different. Mrs. Thomas looked quizzically at her friend. I have heard others say that, but I cannot say I have ever experienced it myself. Mrs. Kelly took a swig from her glass and nodded. I have only felt that way in two places. The first is in that Spewit Vane glen, and the second is in that round tower on St. Patrick's Isle. What is that? Oliver asked. Inside the round tower. Oh, yes, Mrs. Kelly said. Maggie's late husband took me inside once for a look around. It is not part of the usual tour, but they will let you go in if you ask. We went in one evening, and I felt this strange sort of sensation come over me. It was the same as how I felt as a small girl in the glen. I was not uncomfortable or anything. It was just strange. I remember that people used to say that, too, Mrs. Thomas said. I wondered if it had to do with the stories about the ghost of Mardi Dehu. I never felt anything, though, and my husband never did either. That is so interesting, Clara said. And you only felt it in those very specific places. Oh, yes, Mrs. Kelly said. I would have forgotten all about it, but talking about the Spewit Vane glen reminded me of it. I felt it as soon as we walked into the tower, and as soon as I set foot on the stairs to leave it, the sensation was gone. Oliver and Clara's eyes met for a moment. Oliver figured that they must be thinking the same thing. How had they not thought to go into the tower? Oliver had thought that the tower must have been much older than the other structures. It seemed to be in good shape comparatively, but still, why had they not popped in for a look around? They continued chatting with Mrs. Kelly and Mrs. Thomas long into the night, until well after the brandy was long gone. Oliver, though, couldn't stop thinking about the glen at Spewit Vane, the tower he was now itching to explore, and how they suddenly seemed to finally have evidence of magic on this historic isle. Chapter 18. The Round Tower. Oliver and Clara woke early the next morning. They were surprised to find Mrs. Kelly bright-eyed and energetic, greeting them as they made their way to breakfast. Good morning, she said pleasantly. Back to work today or more sightseeing? We will be back to work, I am afraid, said Oliver. But we are better prepared for it now. We are very much refreshed after our little outing yesterday. I am glad to hear it, Mrs. Kelly said. Not much later, Oliver and Clara had eaten and were making their way down to the castle. They were crossing the causeway linking the castle to the rest of the isle, when Oliver finally gave voice to the thought that had been bothering him since the night before. I cannot believe we did not think to go into the round tower, he said, shaking his head. It was right there the whole time. Why should we have done? Clara said, surprise in her voice. It seemed so mundane when compared to everything else, and who would expect to find a centuries-old magical forge inside a castle battlement? I guess that is true, Oliver conceded, but it was the only place left to look, and I might have completely overlooked it. They crossed the causeway and climbed the stairs to enter the castle grounds. Walking into the entrance area, Oliver was so preoccupied he walked straight into Dennis, the guide who had given them their first tour. Oh, sorry, Oliver blurted out as he reached out to the stumbling figure. Dennis recovered his balance and smiled. Not to worry, he said. I have seen you both here a lot lately, and I know you have been asking questions to some of the other guides. It is obvious you must be here working on some sort of research project. I know how distracting that can be." Clara looked surprised. "We are here working on a small project," she said. "It is cultural in nature, but since we have run into you, maybe you can help answer another small question for us." "I shall certainly try," came Dennis's response. "What can you tell us about that tall round tower out on the grounds?" Clara asked. "We thought it was older, but now we are not sure. The battlements do not seem exceptionally old." "Oh, the round tower is a beautiful piece of Celtic construction. It is one of the oldest structures on St. Patrick's Isle. I can understand how you would be deceived, though. The battlements were added at a later date, but the tower itself is mostly original," Dennis explained. "What was something like that originally used for?" Oliver asked. "They were religious buildings," Dennis said. "They might mark important sites or form part of a group of religious buildings. They were built so that the entrance faced towards the chapel. They were often bell towers, but it is possible they were also used as exclusive chapels by local royalty." "That is fascinating," Oliver said. "So the existence of the tower suggests a much older religious site on the Isle, predating the castle." "Oh," said Dennis, "most definitely." "Is there any problem if we go have a look inside?" Clara asked. "Not at all," Dennis replied. "Please come find me afterwards if you have any other questions." They thanked Dennis and set off into the grounds once again, walking quickly through the grass to the tall tower standing over the rest of the grounds. Oliver felt a sense of growing excitement. This had to be it. The solution to all their questions, surely, was just a few purposeful strides away from them now. Arriving at the tower, they climbed an old set of stone steps up to the entrance. Oliver paused slightly at the threshold, looked back at Clara, and then stepped inside. Oliver stood, blinking in the relative darkness of the tower as his eyes adjusted. Clara had followed him in and bumped him slightly in the small entry space. "Is this it?" Clara asked. "I suppose so," Oliver said, looking around. "There is obviously nothing above us." He waved vaguely at the missing floors above them, "and nothing below us either." He pointed at the solid stone floor. "Should we have a more thorough look around?" Clara suggested. Oliver nodded and stepped forward to a wall and began circling the small space. After a few moments, however, Clara interrupted Oliver's pacing. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Disappointed," he replied truthfully. "Why?" "Mrs. Kelly said she felt strange here," Clara explained, "but Mrs. Thomas said she and her husband never felt it. I do not feel anything strange here, do you?" "No," Oliver admitted. "I do not feel anything like that." "Maybe it is because Mrs. Kelly came here in the evening," Clara speculated. "Can magic be stronger or weaker at different times?" Oliver started circling the room again. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Magic can be tied to many different things: the sun, the moon, the time of day. Ancient magic was especially attuned to these. It could be that the magic of the forge was most powerful in the evening, or when the moon was visible, but that does not mean we should not be able to find it now." "Why is that?" Clara responded. "Forging anything takes time," Oliver explained simply. "Even when magic is involved. It takes time and hard effort, as I am sure you know. It does not make sense that you would lock yourself out of the forge until it was at its peak power. You would need to get in early to prepare yourself, your materials, and the forge for the task." Clara was quiet and thoughtful for a moment. Then she, too, started circling the room with Oliver. They circled slowly, examining each stone carefully. Clara tried her ring, and Oliver pulled out his wand, tapping the walls and muttering under his breath, but nothing changed. Suddenly Oliver stopped and said aloud, "Oh, I have been very stupid." Clara looked at him. "That is why I'm here, is it not? One of us has to be smart." "Make your jokes," Oliver said with a chuckle, "but this is a simple problem." "Go on then, simplify it for me." Clara said, sounding amused and curious. If there were a forge here, Oliver said, as walked to the center of the floor and waved his hands around him, where would the space for it be? I do not know, Clara said. It could have been above us, or maybe right here even, but it is all very small. Exactly, Oliver said. It is all very small, but look out the doorway. We are well up off the ground. I said it could not be below us, but obviously there is plenty of space for something below us. Clara looked down at the floor in surprise. There must be another room just below this floor, Oliver continued excitedly. That must be where the forge is. I wager they built this tower over the top of it, just like the keel was built over the top of an older school of healing. So, Clara started slowly, the reason that these ruins have not shown us anything is because they are not magical ruins. They are perfectly ordinary ruins built over the top of something magical, Oliver finished for her. He pointed down at his feet. We need to check the floor. They spent the next few minutes scouring the floor thoroughly, hoping to find some trace or sign that would lead them down into what they hoped was a hidden forge below them. Clara seemed methodical as she moved back and forth across the stones, but Oliver wasn't paying much attention to her. He felt full of an almost manic type of energy. He was running his hands along a small crack, just at the edge of the floor where it met the wall, when he noticed something. There was a small indentation in one of the stones. It was sharp around the edges and deeply cut into the floor, but it would have been unnoticeable had Oliver not been nearly on top of it. Clara, he said excitedly, come look at this. Clara hurried over and dropped to her knees next to Oliver. What is it? She whispered. Look there, he answered, pointing at the mark. Do you see it? Clara bent forward, even further to look where Oliver was pointing. I do not see anything, she started, trailing off before a gasp of, oh, indicated that she had seen it. What is it, though? She asked. It is a rune, Oliver said confidently. It is an ancient symbol used by magical peoples. A rune, Clara said, a note of skepticism in her voice. Oh, very definitely, Oliver said, adjusting his body to get a better look at it. It is a good thing I took NEWT-level ancient runes. Sorry, Clara interrupted. Newt what? Nastily exhaustive wizarding tests, Oliver said, tracing the little inscription with his finger. They are an advanced study level for witches and wizards. Good marks are required before advancing to work in the ministry or to be eligible for more specialized training. Oh, well, Clara said, slightly bemused, of course. That is really what they are called. Probably, Oliver said. Nobody knows for sure, but nobody would believe you anyway if you said it was anything different. But you can read this rune then, right? Clara asked. Because you did a Newt test. I received good marks in the exam, Oliver said slowly, but this rune is unusual, or maybe I should say it is uncommon. No, uncommon is not the right word. It is rare and obscure. It came up in class one time. I only remember it because the professor used it as an example of something we would never see as part of the exams. Its meaning is uncertain and variable. Context matters. Alone, like this, it means something like secrets. They stared at it for a minute. It was a small, vertical line with inward-facing arrows at either end that were slightly offset from the line. It looked like half a box that had been squished a little on the sides. Secrets, Clara repeated after a moment. What kind of secrets? If I had to guess, Oliver said, I would say that this is pointing to a secret under our feet. They stared down at the floor. What now? Clara asked. Now, Oliver said, I think is the time for me to do some magic. Please just check the door to make sure nobody is coming. Clara hurried over to the door and stood casually near the entrance, where she could see anyone coming up to the tower. The question, Oliver muttered, is which spell we need. Oliver paced for a minute, thinking hard. His Reveille spells hadn't shown anything before, although he hadn't been looking at the tower when he tried them. He shook his head. Revelio was designed to reveal something that was hidden. The passage down wasn't hidden, it was non-existent. How do you suppose that someone went down to the forge from here? Oliver asked softly to himself. Probably the same way they went up into the tower, Clara responded. Oliver, surprised at the response, turned to Clara. Sorry, what? It looks like this tower had a combination of ladders and stairs to get to the top, Clara said. Look, you can see the grooves there where the ladder sat. She pointed at two shallow depressions on the floor. And there are a few places on the walls that look like they had stairs running along them at one point. Oliver looked at the places Clara had pointed at, a ladder and stairs. That would surely do the job. They weren't waiting to be revealed, they were waiting to be operated. I wonder, Oliver said into the space. Could it be that easy? He pointed his wand at the rune and said, Descendo. At once, a stone slab dropped out of place, and an opening to a narrow staircase appeared in the floor. Oliver looked back at Clara, whose mouth had dropped open in surprise. Then he moved quickly towards the opening and stepped down through it onto the stairs. He ducked to avoid hitting his head on the floor and saw that the staircase circled gracefully down the tower, hugging tightly to the wall. The room it led to was low, but considerably larger around than the tower above it. Oliver paused on the stairs as he looked down. Excitement coursed through his body, and he felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had done it. After days of searching and work, they had unlocked yet another long-lost magical secret. Well, Oliver reminded himself, they were about to anyway. What is the hold-up? Came Clara's strangely muffled voice from somewhere above Oliver. Hurry before someone else comes along. Oliver turned around to see that Clara's feet were through the opening, but she hadn't been able to come all the way onto the stairs. He laughed to himself and set off once again. Peering down to the floor, Oliver could see the cold remains of the forge. A large stone hearth stood to one side, imposing, deep, cold, and dark. Next to it, he could see the bellows, dusty and lifeless. A little ways in front of the hearth was an anvil, which, even from the stairs, showed the signs of wear from a long life of work. The room would have been dark, except that it was illuminated by a shaft of light which came through the wall and fell directly on the anvil. From there, the light splashed out in all directions, giving the room a cool, dusky glow. Though the sun had been out when they arrived, this did not seem to be the source for the light, for it was completely without warmth. I do not believe it, Oliver said, turning around now that Clara was able to come properly down onto the stairs. Look at this place. It is incredible, Clara said, awe in her voice. This has been here for so long, yet nobody ever knew, and nobody ever found it until now. Well, at least nobody has found it since Merlin and Vivian came here, Oliver said. But we found it. Yes, but now what? Clara asked. How will this help us find Excalibur? Oliver didn't know. He was beginning to ask himself that same question. How could finding this forge, the place where Excalibur was supposed to have been made, help them track down its current location? He shrugged at Clara. I guess we will figure that part of it out, he said, before turning back around. As Oliver reached the bottom of the stairs, he became aware that the walls, dimly lit as they were by the single light beaming into the room, were draped with tapestries. Look at those, he said to Clara. Do they remind you of the tapestries we saw at the round table? Clara peered at them and said, Yes, I suppose they do. They even look like they were made in the same style. The stairs had put them on the opposite side of the room from the stone hearth. The tapestries stretched out in front of them along the curve of the wall. Clara stepped up to them and began to examine them closely. Oliver followed, watching Clara as she stared at each tapestry in turn, mumbling to herself under her breath. In spite of himself, his thoughts wandered back to his decision on the train to show this university student his notes to see what she thought. Of course, he had done that without really bringing her into his confidence. He had hidden the truth from her, or at least parts of it. She had been extraordinary, though. Despite knowing nothing about magic, her keen intellect had consistently helped them solve puzzle after puzzle. She had not complained during their long hours of adventure. She was as strong and resilient as she was clever. Had this been the type of relationship that Merlin had with Arthur? Had he discovered a kindred spirit who just so happened to not have any magical powers? Had Merlin, Arthur, and the other knights of the Round Table left quests behind that were designed to bring magical and non-magical people together? Oliver, Clara interrupted into his train of thought, putting a hand out and tapping his elbow. Did you hear what I said? Sorry, what? Oliver said. These tapestries, Clara said, giving him a sideways glance, they are not normal. Well, we found them in an ancient, hidden, magical forge, Oliver said. I would hardly expect them to be very normal, even by wizard standards. That is not what I mean, Clara said. I do not know how to describe it, but these tapestries are different from the ones in the Round Table room. She paused, staring hard at the image in front of her. It was a woman working at the hearth. The tapestry depicted her plunging something into the fire and then laying it across the anvil and pounding it with a hammer. It is as if they are alive, she said at last, letting each word hang in space. She sounded like she wasn't sure what she would say, and Oliver could see that her face looked surprised at what she had said. I do not know, she said hurriedly, her face a little flushed. I cannot explain it. Oliver stepped up to the tapestry and furrowed his brow in concentration. Clara was perceptive. She was more perceptive than most people, and thanks to the ring that she was still wearing, that extended to the magical world as well. He paced up and down a few of the tapestries. He stared hard at them. He looked into the faces depicted on them and tried to memorize each detail. There was one he even thought looked familiar. It showed a man standing on top of a mountain. Oliver stopped and looked at the floor. He thought about everything that had happened to them since that train ride. I believe you, he said at last. Clara, still looking a little sheepish, wandered off across the room. She was standing near the bellows and beginning to look at the tools that still sat, here and there, on tables or shelves. She looked up when she heard Oliver speak. Thank you, she said. She turned back to the tools on a shelf she was examining. Oliver watched her. He didn't know why, but it seemed to him like she would figure it out. The tapestries didn't seem at all different to him than any other tapestry. He couldn't see anything in them that was even overtly magical. However, he thought to himself, just because he hadn't noticed something didn't mean it wasn't there. Some magic could hide itself from some people while revealing itself to others. Clara was moving along a table when she stopped and leaned over to look at something. She stared for a minute, unmoving, before turning her head and calling back, Here, come look at this. Oliver walked across to her. She was looking down at a large, old, and roughly hewn stone bowl. Something inside it seemed to be giving off a faint, silvery light. What is this? Clara asked, as Oliver stopped next to her. Oliver said nothing for a moment. He stood and stared into the depths of the bowl. He watched a cloudy, silvery substance dance in front of his eyes. It was neither liquid nor gas. It swirled and floated endlessly in front of him. That, he said with awe and surprise in his voice, is a pensieve. That is not helpful, Clara said. Oliver laughed. My apologies. Let me explain. A pensieve is a unique magical object that lets you store and view memories. Say I want to relive a moment of time, such as breakfast this morning. I would extract that memory from my head and place it into the pensieve. Then you and I could enter my memory through the pensieve and experience it. You mean we would go back in time to that moment? Clara asked. Not exactly, Oliver said. It is just a memory of the event, not the real thing. However, by experiencing it that way, you are able to access your memory in a fuller and richer way. You can experience every detail in a way that you cannot when you just remember something. Oliver stared into the bowl. At least that is what I have heard. I have never had a chance to use a pensieve myself. They are very rare. So what is that inside of it? Clara asked. Is it someone's memories? It must be, Oliver said. He pulled out his wand, stirred the cloudy substance a bit, and prodded it, but nothing happened. It continued to swirl and dance as it had before. I do not understand, he said. We should be seeing something now, or hearing something. Everything I read about them says that is how they work. Maybe it is empty, Clara suggested. Maybe there is nothing in it. I do not understand, Oliver repeated. Where would the memories go? I read that they can be preserved indefinitely. They do not go bad, they do not fade away. If you can extract a memory, it can live forever. Are all memories always kept in these? What did you call them? Clara asked. Pensives, Oliver said. Usually, but they can be stored in bottles or vials too. Any container will do. They are convenient for transporting and storing memories. Then you use a pensieve to view the memory. What do the memories look like when they are in one of these? Clara pressed. They look like that, Oliver said, pointing at the stone basin. The illustrations I saw in books showed a thin strand of that substance coming from someone. Once you put it in something, I think it is supposed to look like this. He gestured lamely at the pensieve again. But there do not seem to be any memories left in here. Clara stepped back from the table and paced a little in the room. But there are memories here, she said. What do you mean? Oliver asked, confused. The tapestries, Clara said. They are memories. They have recorded and preserved moments in time, and we can see them right here, right now. Oliver frowned a little bit. Sure, but that is not really the same thing. Paintings and tapestries and other artwork can be imbued with magic. Sometimes they can even talk to you and respond as the person they're portraying once did. But a real memory is something else. It is a perfect record of a moment. It is a recollection of an entire world preserved forever. It is a shame that there was nothing like that left here for us. Oliver looked around aimlessly. He wasn't sure what to do next. It felt like they were at a dead end. We should go, he said. I do not know what any of this is or what it means. That is all right, Clara responded. We should go back to the hotel and update Humphrey and Archibald. They might have some advice for us. That seemed like the most reasonable thing to do, so they ascended the staircase, replaced the stone, and made their way back to the Peel Castle Hotel. The next several days passed uneventfully. Oliver and Clara wrote to Humphrey and Archibald about their discovery, but the two wizards had been just as stumped as Oliver and Clara were. They had asked questions, suggested a variety of unique revealing spells, and recommended everything they could think of. At one point, on a rather speculative request from Archibald, Oliver had even tried to relight the forge. This had accomplished nothing, except to generate an uncomfortable amount of heat inside of a small stone room. Clara had received a few new letters from her family. While Oliver was checking items off the list given to him by Humphrey, Clara took the opportunity to write back. It is difficult, Clara said in the middle of one letter. What do I say? I feel in the wrong for lying to my parents, and even if I tell my uncle partial truths, I feel compelled to hide so much from him. I am sure they would understand if they knew the stakes, Oliver consoled. Clara shrugged and went back to her letters. When she wasn't writing letters, she had taken to sitting in the middle of the room and gazing at the tapestries. I feel as though we simply do not understand what they are telling us, she kept telling Oliver. Personally, Oliver felt that Clara was making an obvious point. They didn't understand the room, but he was also less convinced that the forge had anything to say at all. And why should it? They still didn't have any solid proof that this forge was related in any way to the creation or current location of Excalibur. Sure, the tapestries were suggestive, but that was no guarantee of anything. Tapestries depicting swords in a disused magical forge were hardly unexpected. In Oliver's mind, it was the empty pensieve that seemed like the biggest clue, though. He couldn't explain why such a unique and valuable item had been left there, and he couldn't explain why it was empty. As there was nothing to be gained by saying any of that out loud, however, he had decided to nod when Clara began theorizing about the tapestries, and he busied himself each day testing out any hypothesis or idea that Humphrey and Archibald could come up with. Oliver had expected Humphrey to instruct them to move on, but was surprised when Humphrey had admitted that they also didn't know what to do next. They had been unable to locate a next location for Oliver and Clara to visit, so they suggested that the pair remain in Peel for the time being. Oliver wasn't sure how to feel about this development. The dread he felt about the Black Hand seemed to diminish every day. Without any fresh information or reports, Oliver guessed that they must be as stuck as they were. He had every confidence in Humphrey and Archibald's research abilities. If they were unable to dig up any better leads, then it was unlikely that the Black Hand could do any better. All in all, he was rather glad to be somewhere outside of the archive. It didn't matter that they were spending their days in a stone room under a tower and that they weren't any closer to reaching their objective than they were when they got here. Oliver was quite happy to just be there. It's true, he was frustrated at their lack of progress, but at least they were out doing something. A rustling sound behind him made Oliver turn around. Clara was shifting uncomfortably on the ground and had a pained expression on her face. "Would you like a cushion?" he asked. "I do not want to complain," Clara said, "but these stones are not terribly comfortable." Oliver nodded sympathetically. "We have been in here a lot longer today. Judging by some of the suggestions on the list, I think Archibald stayed up all night coming up with ideas. I am not even halfway through with them yet." He held up the parchment with the list on it. He had been crossing off items as he tried them. For each one, he had made a little note after the idea that said, "Nothing happened." He shook his head and sighed audibly before putting the list down. "Just one moment," he said, concentrating. He had to cross out the last idea he'd tried. It had involved tracing runes into the air in different parts of the room. Once finished, the runes were meant to glow and then reveal any magical secrets between the circle they formed. They had all glowed a fiery orange, but then nothing had happened. Oliver crossed it out and made his usual note. Picking up his wand again, he turned back to Clara. "Now about that cushion." He focused for a second, and then, with a wave, conjured a comfortable-looking cushion out of the air. Clara took the cushion and looked very pleased. "I still do not think that I shall ever really become accustomed to that," she said, "but it is very useful, thank you." "One more thing," Oliver said. "I notice that the parchment is starting to deform the leather pouch you have carried it in. I would like to put an undetectable expanding charm on it so that it can carry the parchment more easily. Would that be all right?" "Sorry, what charm?" Clara asked. "It is the same type of charm I have placed on my own luggage. It allows me to carry so many other useful items without drawing attention to myself. I think it would be useful to have on your bag as well," Oliver explained. "Of course, I may have to remove the charm again when this is all over. But for now, while we are staying at the hotel, it is much less conspicuous to hide items in your bag than it is for me to carry my luggage around." "I suppose that would be all right," Clara said, untying the bag and handing it over. Oliver took the bag, stuck his wand into it, and muttered capacious extremis as he focused hard on the desired effects. He peered into the bag and, now satisfied, he handed it back to Clara. "I am not supposed to do that," he said. "Firstly, that spell is heavily regulated by the ministry. It is complicated magic, and if we lost that bag, it would be a massive breach of the Statute of Secrecy. It is difficult to explain how a small bag can fit something as big as you or I without magic being involved. Secondly, that bag belongs to you, and you are a muggle, so we should not mention this to anyone else." Clara looked a little alarmed. "Are you going to get into trouble for this? Am I?" "Of course not," Oliver responded. "Well, almost certainly not." He paused and looked at her. "We are on a very important assignment that might prevent a mass conflict between the Muggle and Wizarding worlds. I have already taken you, a Muggle, to an official ministry building. I have introduced you to multiple ministry officials. I have shown you magic. I have traveled magically with you more than once, and using more than one method. I have told you so much about wizards that I just said Statute of Secrecy to you, and you knew what that was. And you are currently wearing a powerful magical artifact that we found last week. So I seriously doubt that this spell will be the one that gets me into trouble. Oliver was listing his infractions on his fingers, each one causing him to chuckle with a little more than the last. Clara still looked a little alarmed, but Oliver laughed. Just make sure we do not lose that bag. Come on, it looks like I will need your help for the next few of these. He was scanning the list. Oh no, it looks like there is a whole section later on that involves goblins. He sighed, crossing them out and scrawling a large, "No goblins to be found in Peel" in the margin. Well, at least we will not have to do those, but we do need to finish these. I do not know if the castle will be open to us tomorrow. Are they open on Sundays?